Today in On the Go, we continue our conversation on air taxis. No question, they are on the horizon of our transportation future, but will they be safe, and perhaps even safer, than air travel as we know it today?
The certification of an autonomous aircraft is going to be significantly more rigorous than the certification, which is non-existent right now, of an autonomous car.
Hello and welcome to On the Go, the podcast from the Tampa Bay Area Regional Transit Authority. I'm your host, Chris Jadek, and this is part 2 of our look at air taxis with CAMI co-founders Dietrich and Yolanka Wulff. CAMI, C-A-M-I, stands for the Community Air Mobility Initiative. In part 1, we talked about the future possibilities of air taxi travel, where the industry is right now, and some of the vehicles in development. We'll pick up our conversation when I asked Anna about safety, especially if air taxis are to be flown autonomously without a pilot. Is the public ready to accept that, given the occasional accidents we've already seen on land from autonomously driven vehicles?
Yeah, I definitely think that there's work to be done on both certification of and acceptance of autonomous aircraft. I will say that there are some very significant differences between autonomous aircraft and autonomous cars, not the least of which is the fact that the operating environment for an aircraft is significantly more predictable than that for a car. All the aircraft that are in flight at any given moment are all following a very clear set of right-of-way rules. Many of them are under direct control from air traffic control. There's a lot more clarity around you're not going to have somebody's cat darting out in front of your autonomous aircraft in flight, right? So, I think that it's a simpler problem in many ways. There's also significant differences in the regulatory environment, both from a certification and from an operations perspective. NHTSA has been mostly silent on autonomy for the automotive industry, which leaves the manufacturers really on their own to figure out what is an acceptable level of safety, what is an acceptable testing protocol, there has been very little federal guidance for the automotive industry on autonomy. Oh, and also for automotive, the states regulate the operation in a fairly piecemeal fashion and in a fairly light-handed fashion. So, some states require that you get a smog test, some states require that you have an inspection sticker, but, everybody has their own driver's licensing requirements. Operations is very a light touch and not at all sort of uniform for automotive, which poses challenges when you're trying to add autonomy into that mix. Aviation, in contrast, has a very federalized, very centralized, very heavy-handed certification process that has been established over the last number of decades, and it works very well. It has resulted in creating the safest possible transportation system in the world. It's the safest thing you can do with yourself is get on a commercial flight, right? So there is a lot to be said for that approach, and there are a lot of conversations happening between industry and the regulator at this point to figure out how do we define what is good enough for aviation autonomy. What do those requirements look like? What sets of data need to be collected and demonstrated before we can put one of these aircraft into operations? So the certification of an autonomous aircraft is going to be significantly more rigorous than the certification, which is non-existent right now, of an autonomous car, right? So that's hopefully of comfort to folks that there is actually a lot of smart people having conversations about how do we do this and how do we know it's safe enough? And then from an operational perspective, you're not going to have, at least not in my foreseeable future, you're not going to have just anybody hopping into one of these things and being fully responsible for it by themselves without being part of, one of those Part 135 organizations that I was talking about, or an airline, or being a certified pilot. There's a standardized set of training that one has to accomplish in order to be able to operate an aircraft. And it's the same no matter what state you're in. So I think that there's an opportunity there as well. It's also interesting to note that most of the accidents that we see in general aviation, which is the type of aviation that we'd be seeing air taxis operate in, are due to human error, right? Despite all of that training, despite how hard it is to become a pilot, and despite biannual training and recurring testing and everything else, people make mistakes. And unlike people, if a software program makes a mistake, you can fix it, and then it will never make that mistake again. So we can start eliminating mistakes out of autonomous aviation in a way that, despite our best efforts, we haven't been able to eliminate out of human pilots. So I think there's some promise for increased safety there as well. But yeah, it's weird. It's going to be really weird to get on a plane and not see a pilot up front the first time, right? Like it's going to be really weird. Most of our commercial airline flights are already flown by the computer most of the time anyway. People don't really realize that. There's still a guy in a snazzy uniform up front. There's going to be some getting used to, but I do have confidence in the certification processes that are being worked through now, and in the industry's ability to continue to maintain a high level of safety as we go forward, potentially higher than where we are today.
And while we're on that topic of regulation, let's talk about airspace and how that would be managed around the globe, or certainly here in the United States. As we all know, when we're on a commercial airliner, it takes time to get on the runway. It takes time to get clearance, and that's just one jet. If you have dozens more, hundreds more of these UAM vehicles out there, how does that get managed? Has there been a lot of thought or consideration? Is that still being sorted out?
I'll start this and then turn it over to Anna, since this is more of her bailiwick. But I do want to comment this, that from the perspective of having these vehicles as part of an integrated transportation system, it's really important to understand that a 15-minute flight isn't very useful if you spend 45 minutes getting onto that flight and 45 minutes disembarking from that flight just to connect to your next mode of transportation. From an industry perspective, but also from a transportation planning perspective, we understand that this has to operate much more quickly than what most of us think of as kind of that traditional aviation flow, where we go to the airport, we check in, we go through security, we wait to board, we board, there's a lengthy time while all the clearances happen, and we finally push from the gate and taxi out. That's not going to work for a 10 or 15-minute flight. So fortunately, not only industry, but FAA and NASA within this country and CAA's Civil Aviation Authorities, around the globe understand that this has to operate in a different way while still maintaining safety, and very likely much higher volumes than we're used to in traditional aviation, in legacy aviation. So, Anne, I'll turn it over to you for some of the technical aspects of that.
Sure. No, very, very good point about, the timing is critical for this to be useful. I think, we have working in our favor the fact that these are smaller aircraft. So you're not trying to board 200 people. You've got, 2 to 6 that you're getting on and off. So that's, that helps. And the other piece that I think is really going to be foundational to the sort of run phase of this industry, people talk about it in terms of crawl, what we can do immediately, walk, we're sort of getting our, finding our stride and increasing volumes, and then run is really kind of at scale, like, George Jetson, right? So to get to that run phase, and probably into the walk phase of this, we have to reimagine how we do air traffic control. So right now, air traffic control is done completely through voice communication. So me as the pilot and you as the controller are talking to each other. And every aircraft that has a pilot on board, that pilot has to talk to air traffic control. And pilots get very good at this. I learned how to fly at a very busy airport, so I got good at it real fast. I got better at radios and I got it flying the plane right away, because you have to get off the ground, right? But it's still a very rate limiting thing. For safety, you repeat back, right? So everything's said twice. And it's, one person talking at a time on the radio frequency, right? So that is a significant limiter for, getting clearance to get out of the gate, get onto the runway, right? Having a system that allows for either direct vehicle to vehicle deconfliction, where my aircraft is talking to your aircraft and we figured out based on who's ready to go, which one of us is going first, and the plane's just sorted out. So I don't have to talk to anybody about it. So those kinds of things are going to be important. They're also, that vehicle to vehicle communication is also a great tool to use for actual flight operations, to make sure that we're following the rules of the road and giving right of way, rules of the air, giving right of of way to other aircraft as appropriate. And that can all be done real time without having to have this serialized voice communication. If we do want to have a centralized controlling entity involved, that's certainly possible. A lot of the CONOPs that have been proposed thus far do have that. They haven't broken that far from the traditional air traffic control mechanisms, but even there, they could be digital. It could be data directly to the aircraft computer from a centralized computer. So I'm personally a fan of vehicle-to-vehicle communication. I think it's more robust from a safety perspective, as well as potentially allowing for a larger volume of flights. But either way you go with it, we have to get away from the voice-to-voice sort of conversational aspect of air traffic control, or we're going to keep having that as a bottleneck.
When I go to rent a car, if I'm at the airport, there are a lot of different companies there. There's Hertz, there's Avis, there's Dollar, and a whole bunch more. How do you see the industry shaking out? Will there be various companies to choose from? Because we know there are a lot of companies vying for this space now. Or will it be regulated to where you only have one or two companies serving a particular area?
I think you're going to see a mix. And I think you're going to see a mix of companies that are producing aircraft. And we've talked a little bit about some of the different technology configurations that you'll see from, between fixed wing and eVTOLs, electric vertical takeoff and landings. Anna talked a little bit about the wing-borne versus rotor-borne difference, as well as fuel sources. But you'll also see a mix of operators. And in some cases, the companies that are manufacturing the aircraft may also want to be the operators running those fleets. In other cases, they'll be different. A company will focus just on the manufacturing of an aircraft and then sell or lease to an operator. So one of the questions that communities are looking at now is how do we configure these operations within our town, within our metropolitan area? Do we go with one operator, whether that's an operator or an operator manufacturer combination? If we put funding into a vertiport or other infrastructure, do we want it to be accessible to more than one operator, or do we put all of our eggs in one basket? Certainly, cities have had challenges in the past within the transportation industry of having a single operator run an entire system and then have that company go out of business or whatever. So these are some of the interesting questions that cities and industry are grappling with right now. What do these different configurations look like? And I don't think we'll end up with one answer. I think it's going to depend on the city or the metropolitan area, on the use cases that are important to them, on what's involved in building out the infrastructure, what that community's priorities are, and what their opportunities are.
Let's take a minute to talk about Florida and specifically Tampa Bay for a moment. Air taxis have been getting a lot of conversation here recently. How feasible or how attractive is this area, this state, to the industry, or does it not make any difference at all, whether it's here or Cleveland, Ohio?
I think that it's interesting because as we have conversations with different jurisdictions, everyone tells us that they're the leader in this industry. So I think from our perspective, we love to see the enthusiasm and the effort going behind that. We're certainly seeing a lot of activity in Florida. And as you know, we've worked with Tampa Bay. We've also worked with some other locations in Florida. So certainly I think there's a lot of excitement and energy happening in Florida. I think Florida has some great advantages as compared to other places. Other places have different advantages. I think, I live in the Seattle area, so we deal with a lot more challenging weather than Florida does. Florida certainly has its issues with hurricanes, but you also have other issues that, or you don't have some of the issues that we have up in the north, I would say. I think you have a strong space and aviation industry, although I would argue that Washington State does as well as the original home of Boeing. And, I think you have some different regulatory structures. You have a strong state regulatory system over this that is different from some other states. And in some ways that's certainly easier for industry not to be dealing with a whole kind of smorgasbord of different regulations. I think, what I would say is that there's a lot of interest in Florida. We've certainly seen that, and interest in not only within a metropolitan region, but connecting metropolitan regions across the state.
One of the biggest hurdles for any new industry is always the money and the financing. So who pays for all of this? Is it going to be solely privately funded, or do you think the industry is looking for government to do more than just regulate it and clear them to operate? Are they going to look for investment from the public sector?
I think for what I've seen from an aircraft development perspective is that is being primarily, privately funded. I think as we start looking at early stage operations and infrastructure build out, that's where the public sector has a role to play. And I would actually encourage the public sector to think about that as a real source of influence over all of this, where, you can kind of put a finger on the scale to encourage companies to do things in a way that benefit a larger swath of the population earlier than maybe they would do if it was a purely private financial based decision. So by freeing some organizations from looking at it purely from a return on investment perspective and where can they get the highest profit margins the fastest, I think there's opportunities to get through that cost curve that we were talking about faster, to have more equity in the implementation of these systems faster. So I think that while there may not be a necessity for public funding to step into this, I think there's a lot of private money that's interested in paying for stuff here. I mean, there's estimates that are saying this could be a $2 trillion market, right? Like there's a lot of people that want a piece of that. But I do think that there's a really valuable role that public organizations and public funding can play in setting this up for the maximum long-term benefit. So I think it's a great thing to consider. And if there's a partnership opportunity there that maximizes the benefit for all parties, I know I'm always interested in those mutual win-win sorts of scenarios. So hopefully we can find some of those as we move forward.
We've talked a lot about the issues facing the industry and the hurdles. Are there any items that also need to be considered, maybe that you want our listeners to know about that we haven't touched about? What other obstacles is the industry facing that we're going to have to grapple with?
I would say two issues. One is equity and one is climate, and the other is climate change. So what we are seeing over and over as we talk to different localities is that these have become priorities for these communities. They're written in as top level policies that need to be incorporated and considered into all of the actions that city, for example, takes. And a lot of community leaders are very mindful of some of the inequitable consequences of decisions, particularly in transportation, that have taken place over the last 50 years, including impacts on communities like gentrification and displacement. So I think industry and anybody involved in trying to implement this form of transportation needs to be very mindful of those, that this is a big concern for communities. I think another place where you see this is in infrastructure, and particularly when it comes to impact on the grid. So these vehicles will take, a lot of electricity to charge and run, and communities don't want there to be certain populations that disproportionately feel the impact of that, whether it's cost or whether it's brownouts. The other big issue is climate change and making sure that, this whole new form of transportation, we know that using electricity over fossil fuels is cleaner, but we need to look at this from a life cycle perspective. We need to look at this, what happens to the batteries after they go through their useful life? Where is the energy source being sourced from to recharge batteries? So I think industry needs to be ready to address those issues as they start to have these conversations with communities, because the communities have chosen these as top priorities in all of their actions.
I have one final question for both of you. You've taken a lot of time today, and I do appreciate that. So I'm going to allow you each to respond to this question. really looking out over the future here, as you look out, say, 50 years from now, when so many other transportation technologies will converge and no doubt new ones will emerge, where do you see UAM technology in the transportation landscape? Is this going to become a staple of public transportation like buses and subways? Or do you think it's going to remain a niche service that serves a specific portion of the population? Where do you see this industry going? Anna, I'll ask you to start with that.
I can't pawn it off on Yolanka. No, it's a great question, and I wish I had the crystal ball that could give us the answer. I think that, people have a tendency to overestimate what they can do in the short term and underestimate what we can do in the long term. So I think our visions for what this is going to look like in 5 to 10 years are probably wildly optimistic. And our visions for the impact that this can have 50 years from now are nowhere close to what we're actually going to see. So I'm very excited to see where this develops. I'm excited to see the when my kids start flying away to college, that they can get to the airport on a flying taxi, right? We live just in the Bay Area. So I think that there's going to be a learning curve and some growing pains, and then I think eventually it'll become, we don't even talk about it anymore. It's just a thing, right? Do we talk about our minivans? Yeah, no, it's just a thing, right? But they're technological marvels, really, if you think about it. So yeah, I think it'll normalize. I think it'll become ubiquitous if we do it right now, right? Like if we don't do it right now and we make decisions that make this be a poor cost-benefit trade-off for most of the people in most communities, it'll fizzle. So this is kind of our opportunity and our burden right now, is to, if we do this right and we pay attention to some of the considerations that Yolanka has mentioned and we've talked about here, I think it has the opportunity to be ubiquitous and to save a lot of people a lot of time and to be a benefit for the environment. But we have to be deliberate about that to get there.
Yolanka, you'll get the final word. What would you like to add on to that, and what your vision may be for how our children and grandchildren will be using this technology?
Well, I would agree with what Anna said. I would simply add to it that I think that while it will be ubiquitous, it will be so in different forms. I think that one of the amazing things we'll see is the reconnection of smaller communities that lost connectivity when we lost a lot of the regional airlines due to high fuel costs and high operating costs. And those communities became isolated, and we ended up very much with an aviation system that was very much hub and spoke. So being able to kind of create a spider web out of that hub and spoke to reconnect those small communities, to provide faster services to more rural communities, I think is another set of impacts that falls under that, what we talked about, that larger umbrella of advanced air mobility that doesn't impact urban life so much. So I think that in some of the mega cities that we see growing around the world, this is going to become a very necessary and very typical way of getting around megacities. I think as we continue to see the use of these vehicles in disaster response, in emergencies, in medical situations, I think we're going to open up a whole new way of addressing some of those issues. We've certainly seen a lot of really great work, for instance, in Africa with the delivery of medical goods and medical services. So I think when we look at this broadly, we'll see that there are all kinds of opportunities to implement this on a very large scale, but I don't think it will look the same everywhere.
Anna Dietrich, Yolanka Wulff, thank you for joining us today. This has been a fascinating conversation, and if our listeners are like me, they learned a lot. We'll leave it there, but the future has some fascinating possibilities. Once again, I'm Chris Jadek, and you have been listening to On the Go, the podcast from the Tampa Bay Area Regional Transit Authority.